Canadians and who we are as a country. There are 7 other challenges in combating poverty which I think are also very important to keep in mind. The first of which is there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of biases, and a lot of prejudices around this issue. When I sat on the plane coming over from Ottawa on Sunday, I sat next to a very nice woman, about my age, similar kind of background, 2 kids like me, and she was going to something in Regina speaking on women's empowerment or something. But when I told her what I did, and there was just sort of a blank look like, what are you talking about? And I don't fault her for that, because if you haven't experienced poverty or grown up in poverty, it can be difficult to understand what we're really talking about. And part of the challenges of this issue is to help share the stories and the realities of people who experience poverty today or have experienced it in the past. And that may include some of you in this room. I know, Debbie and Bonnie are people who've experienced it directly for various reasons. Yesterday we met with 3 Regina women who each had their own individual, very powerful story to tell. One woman who contracted MS when she was in her 20s and is now completely paralyzed, but her spirit is strong, her will is strong. She's experienced poverty, but she's fighting hard for justice. Another woman who went into foster care when she was young, according to her, was in an abusive situation, even with her foster parents, was told she was too stupid to complete high school, now working on her 3rd degree, a Master of Sociology, and fighting back and very much an advocate in her own right. And the 3rd woman from Hungary, has been in Canada many years, but separated from her husband, number of kids. The youngest is only 4 or 5. She's single. She's got still a young family to care for. She has a number of factors that make her fall through the cracks of whatever social security system we have. And there's many other stories that illustrate the diversity of reasons why people fall into poverty. And part of our job at Canada Without Poverty is to help communicate those realities, to overcome the misconceptions and the biases and the prejudices. The second challenge, I think, is that we very much still have a charity model in response to this issue. I noticed in the Regina paper on Monday that they were applauding that Regina beat out Victoria for the food bank drive. And that's all well and good, but it helps to reinforce the charity model that is in some ways part of the problem, because this is a fundamental issue of justice. With the charity model comes, I think, a very paternalistic approach. We must help the most vulnerable, give to the poor, those kinds of phrases. And I don't think those kinds of ideas are ultimately where we need to get to. The third challenge is market fundamentalism. Let the free market solve our problems. And your Minister of Social Services, or whatever she's called, Donna Harpower, was quoted in the paper as saying, well, we think the best approach is not to have a plan, but to create economic opportunity. We'll just create enough jobs, and that wealth is going to spread around, and we're all going to be dancing in the fields. But we've had, as I mentioned, we've had several decades of massive economic growth, and Saskatchewan's going through a bit of a boom with your resource sector. But that wealth is definitely not trickling down to where it's needed. And I don't think we can solve this problem strictly from a market fundamentalism approach. Related to that, in fact, the irony is that market fundamentalism and an over-reliance on the market, the reality is, if you've seen Michael Moore's great new film, Capitalism, A Love Story, you know that capitalism disproportionately benefits those who have assets. And this is the cruel irony of what the market fundamentalists are talking about, is in fact the emphasis on that makes it more likely that we're going to have poverty, not less. We have outdated systems of social supports is another challenge. From our welfare systems, which are rooted in a sort of a mindset and a framework that goes back quite a long time, and obviously is not overcoming the problem. In some ways, it's regulation of the poor. We have certainly a lack of political vision and a lack of courage and will on this issue. Everywhere, in some places we have it. Like in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Premier, Danny Williams, is very committed to this issue. When he was re-elected last fall, I heard a clip of him on CBC where he said, the measure of a government is not what we do for those who have much, but what we do for those who have little. He was quoting Franklin Roosevelt. I thought it was an extraordinary thing for a premier to say, but his government over the past 4 or 5 years has been very determined on this issue and has, in our view, one of the best plans that we've seen to combat poverty in a very comprehensive way, with real investments and real commitment that goes across departments and engages civil society and so forth. But for Canada as a whole, that's not the case. And in Saskatchewan, it doesn't appear to be the case yet that we have this sort of level of political vision and courage and will. And I think also our first past-the-post voting system hinders progress on this issue because it prevents parties from really saying what they mean and standing up for what they mean and being able to form coalitions to work with each other where there's some common ground. But in the race to get all the votes in a given riding, well, I think it disenfranchises a lot of people who care about a lot of issues who know they can't win in their riding because it's a conservative riding or a liberal riding or whatever. So I think this is part of the challenge that we face. But we're not powerless on this. It's very easy to feel powerless on these issues because they're so big and they're so challenging. And as individuals, we can't really do very much on our own. But we can do a lot together. So we have a lot of opportunity to make a very determined response. At the individual level, of course, we can raise our awareness, we can improve our understanding, and we can get engaged in a very direct way. I think many of you are embodiments of that. At the neighborhood level, we can organize. The group ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, which is huge in the US and has got some notoriety around voting fraud issues and so forth. But they've got a really interesting model for neighborhood engagement of low and middle income households around issues of concerns at that neighborhood level. We have an ACORN group in Canada that's doing good work in Toronto and Ottawa and Vancouver. At the community level, the entire community level, we can organize as well. I know there's a lot of that going on, and there's the Regina Anti-Poverty Coalition and other groups in Regina, same in Saskatoon. Vibrant Communities is a really interesting model for community engagement, bringing different types of stakeholders together to talk about poverty, to act on poverty, government, business, low income, academia. Municipalities have a big role to play in the policies that they create, the bylaws they create, even the design of communities is really important, sort of the urban form or suburban form. Do we develop mixed income neighborhoods? Do we develop walkable communities where people can really congregate and get to know each other? Or do we build these enclaves of wealth and low income and so forth? Public transit, big responsibility there. And of course, at the provincial level and the federal level, there's a need for plans, there's a need for legislation that commits to action, there's a need for progressive policies, legislation and progressive taxation. We're all too small, though, as our individual organizations to make a difference. That's the reality of this issue. Like climate change, despite the largest groups in the world working on these issues, if they try to do it by themselves, they're too small to make a difference. I think part of the reason haven't had the success to the degree we want on poverty an issue is that groups have not yet come together enough. We splinter off into housing groups and child care groups and women's groups and child poverty groups and whatever the interest happens to be. But we are much stronger if we work much more closely together, and we have to find the means to make that happen. And that's really the spirit of the Dignity for All campaign, which I'll now focus on. This campaign is meant to be like a full court press, to use a basketball term, where you take all of your team members and you go into the other team's end and you pin them down and you put the pressure on them. Well, that's what we're trying to do with this campaign with the federal government and parliamentarians generally, not just the government, but in fact all parliamentarians from all parties. We want to put a full court press on them and say this is a critically important issue for the country. And it goes beyond looking at as a problem of a minority of people who happen to be suffering in poverty today. It affects all of us in profound ways. And by tackling poverty, the country is going to improve in profound ways. So we're trying to get all the federal parties to sort of grasp that understanding and make some pretty powerful commitments. There are 3 goals to this campaign, which are outlined on the card, and they're very high level, and the card doesn't do them really the justice because there's not enough space there. But the goals are simple. We want a federal plan to combat poverty. For poverty elimination is the phrase we're using, not poverty reduction, but in fact elimination, because that is the goal that we should be striving towards. We should not be striving towards something that leaves, at the end of the day, is going to leave some people out. We want that plan to be integrated with provincial plans as they come along, and to support and complement and strengthen those plans. We have plans for Newfoundland and Labrador, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and a bit of a, I'm sorry to say, a bit of a joke of a plan for Nova Scotia, which isn't even worth kind of bringing up, but it's a footnote. And hopefully the new government there will seek to amend it and strengthen it. But those other 4 provinces have reasonably serious looking plans, reasonably serious levels of commitments. And we're going to see a plan coming forward from New Brunswick next month is their timeline. And we should see plans for other jurisdictions in time. Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC appear to be the 3 laggards in the country on this. PEI is committed to a plan. The Yukon is committed to a plan. I'm not sure about the other 2 territories. Our second goal is we want a federal act that ensures the federal government will be at the table for years to come and that this commitment can survive the change in governments. We want that act to have provisions for accountability on this issue. Part of the reason that the 1989 pledge to eliminate child poverty was not successful, in my view, was because there was no accountability built behind that commitment. There was no minister, there was no department, there was no necessary program, and there was no means of necessarily even measuring success. There has to be accountability, and this act, as we envision it, would include mechanisms for accountability. The act is inspired after the Quebec experience, where a grassroots coalition worked for a number of years in the 1990s to create the vision and the political will to have an act to combat poverty and social exclusion, which is its name in Quebec, Bill 112, which was passed in 2002. Came about through grassroots pressure with a huge citizens coalition, which eventually had 5,000 people come into arena to hammer out the final wording of their vision of the bill, and they got it through the Quebec National Assembly. And that is now a piece of legislation that binds the Quebec government to action. Doesn't necessarily solve all the problems in Quebec, but it is a strong reference point for them. The third goal is very broad, and it's simply we want sufficient federal investment in social security for all Canadians, whether you're a child or in the working age, or you're a person with a disability, or you're an Aboriginal, or you're a senior. Everybody deserves and has the right to social security. And our governments have an obligation to ensure that social security is provided. It's not an option, it's a responsibility. So these are the 3 high-level goals. Briefly on how the campaign is structured, we have a 14-member campaign committee representing a diversity of groups. They're listed on the campaign card. We have representation from the Canadian Labour Congress, which is our largest umbrella labour organization in the country, Canadian Teachers Federation, Canadian Association of Social Workers, some other social justice groups like Acorn Canada, Citizens for Public Justice, Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, and the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry in the person of your one and only Bonnie Morton, who we fly with a cape on our back across the country to take part in meetings. But we wanted Bonnie to be on the committee, in particular because we want to ensure the first voice perspective is heard. It's very important that the first voice perspective come through these deliberations, and Bonnie brings that plus many other attributes to the committee. So we have those 14 groups, but it's going to take much, much, much more than that. So if you go onto the website, dignityforall.ca, you'll see listed there all the groups that have endorsed the campaign so far. We have about 190, and it's climbing every day by a few every day now, and we hope it will rocket up much more than that. We have, I think, over 2,600 individuals, and we want to boost those numbers up to the next milestones, 500 groups and 10,000 individuals, and then we'll go on from there to 1,000 groups and 100,000 individuals, and then we'll go on from there to hopefully 2,000 groups, and I hope 1 million individuals. It's daunting, but we've seen through other campaigns that in fact, that kind of level of support can take place. Now that we already have a sizable body of groups to back this campaign, our challenge is to mobilize. It's beyond the endorsement, which you can do right now, should you so choose, to add your personal endorsement or your group's endorsement. Beyond that, there's lots of other things that can be done, and we're going to need to have that mobilization to make this campaign successful. Because a few groups in Ottawa can't do this by themselves. Even a few groups in Ontario and Quebec can't do this by themselves. It's going to take a coast-to-coast-to-coast mobilization. So we're asking groups to consider making links on their websites to the campaign, broadcasting the campaign through their newsletters and other social media, encouraging their individual members to sign on to the campaign, engage in the policy discussion that we're going to have around the plan and the Act. I should say on the Act itself, we've already got very quick movement on this from one of our members of Parliament, Tony Martin, who's dedicated virtually his entire legislative career over some 20 years in Ontario and federally to this issue. He's extremely dedicated. He's already drafted or had others draft up the beginning language of a Federal Poverty Elimination Act. That's actually an NDP campaign promise, but now some flesh is coming onto the bones, so to speak. We're involved in that process. Our campaign is actually involved in that process so that we get an act that is close or hopefully exactly to the vision that we want. Same with the plan. We want to be very deliberative with this. We're not asking government to go away and come back and give us a plan. We want to create this plan, and this needs to be extensive input from across the country, thinking through all the elements that ought to be in a comprehensive approach to tackling this big and challenging problem. So you can engage in the policy discussion. You can, if you have some influence with your member of parliaments or members of parliament or senators from Saskatchewan, like Ralph Goodale here in Regina, if you have some connection to those kinds of people, you can help the campaign by connecting the campaign to those individuals, encouraging those politicians to endorse the campaign and get into the deeper message of the campaign. We have a number of parliamentarians have endorsed Jack Layton, some of his caucus, Mike Savage from the Liberals, Senator Hugh Segal from the Conservatives, who's extremely progressive on this issue. It's his #1 domestic policy priority, and to hear him speak, and I would encourage you to invite him to come to the university and speak on this issue. He's very persuasive as to why it's so important that poverty be tackled. I'll just close then with a few inspirational quotes. Hopefully you find them. Gandhi said that poverty is the worst form of violence. And that might seem to be an extreme statement. And of course, he was making it within the context of India in the early part of the last century. But people in poverty often referred to how they feel beaten by poverty. One of our former board members talked about feeling the chains of poverty, shackled by poverty. And I don't think it's an inaccurate description to think of poverty as the worst form of violence, because it's something that can be prevented. The damage it causes is extreme in so many ways. Nelson Mandela says that poverty is not a natural condition of man, but it's a condition that's man-made and therefore can be eradicated by the actions of man. If Nelson Mandela can have that belief in a South African context or African context, we surely can have the same belief here in Canada. Martin Luther King said that true compassion is more than flipping a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And that's what we're trying to do with this campaign. We're trying to restructure the edifice that produces the beggars in the first place. We have to get to the upstream end of this cycle. Bonnie and Debbie have heard this 3 times now, so they're getting, oh, not this one again, but coming from my environmental background, where I actually did work on water pollution issues, I got exposed to, well, if you actually want to combat water pollution, it's much better to do it up in the upper part of the watershed. Protect your watershed, protect your source, invest there, rather than wastewater treatment plants downstream and cleanups. The city of New York years ago was facing a water quality crisis, and they did the analysis and they figured it's better to spend billions protecting the watershed on the upper Hudson River than investing in billions more in the downstream pollution that would result if they don't protect that clean water. It's the same with poverty. We're much better off investing in the upstream of this course than on the downstream where all the consequences occur. And that's what Martin Luther King was speaking about in tackling the edifice. And Henry Thoreau said that for every person who's hacking at the branches of a problem, there's one person hacking at the root. Canada Without Poverty has always, since we were founded in 1971, we've always tried to hack at the root of this problem. We don't do direct service delivery, we don't do emergency food aid, although if someone calls us with a particular problem, and we will handle those emergency calls as best we're able, but we're a small staff, we're not in position to do that kind of work. Others do that much better. The food banks do a good job, by and large, in raising food from the community and getting it out there to those in immediate need, but that's not addressing the systemic causes. We're trying to address the systemic causes of this issue. So I'll just leave it at that. I want to have lots of time for Q&A and discussion. I'm here to listen as much as, listen more than talk. I'd rather do more listening than talking. And I know there's a lot of wisdom and experience in this room, and then maybe there's some things that you can share right now that will help to further inform how we conduct this campaign, how to make it most successful. And I'd be interested to know, if you are interested in getting involved, sort of what kind of connections you might have. In the day and a bit I've already been in Regina, I've already seen a huge number of connections just from within Regina and Saskatchewan that can help this campaign move forward, and that's what it's going to take to make it successful. So thanks very much.
The floor is open.
Thank you for your presentation and your thoughts. I don't know if others are interested in this question, but I'd be curious to know how you're defining poverty and maybe some of the different definitions. You mentioned the low-income cutoff as an example.
Yes, that's an important question because Canada doesn't have official poverty measures. Groups like ours and others, and even the federal government, have used different low-income measures as proxies for poverty. There is some danger in that. We've taken a look at what's in the Quebec bill, actually. The Quebec bill has a definition of poverty which is very good, in my view. It has an income. There's income is there, but there's other things as well, because I don't have the exact, it's like a few lines, but it talks about poverty as a condition of not having the resources and the various supports that basically enable sort of full participation in society, in addition to income. And we have to be careful not to define it just on an income metric alone. We've actually suggested to Tony Martin that his bill for poverty, the Poverty Elimination Act, actually include that same recommendation that's in the Quebec legislation, and he's agreed to do that, and that when we see the draft bill come forward, we should see that definition of poverty in there. It's going to be important to measure progress that we are using a consistent metric, and that metric has to be robust. There are different ones out there. In Quebec, a group of academics recently just has recommended, I think, to the Quebec government that they use the market basket measure, which is one of the income measures that's out there, and it's, in our view, more robust than the low-income cutoff. But we need to have some robust metrics that we're using consistently over time. So we, I just even today we were in a meeting with Dwayne Lingenfelter, and I referred to the market basket measure numbers for 2007 for Saskatchewan, which are different from the low-income cutoff numbers. And so people can get really confused. The Conference Board of Canada came out with their data about on September the 17th, and is using the 50% of median income as the poverty measure. And so you have different rates of poverty based on that. And so it is confusing for people, and there has to be some sorting out of it. I think having official poverty measures, I think, is worthwhile, but a lot of care has to be taken in identifying what those should be. Yes?
Jim, can I just interrupt for a second? There's 15 viewers online, so if you don't mind, could you just repeat the question from the audience? So there's just the one mic as well.
Okay. So that particular question was, what poverty measure are we using to define poverty in Canada? Yes?
To what extent are Aboriginal organizations involved in your Dignity for All campaign?
Yes. So the question is, to what extent are Aboriginal organizations involved in the Dignity for All campaign? We have invited the Assembly of First Nations to have a seat at the campaign committee. They haven't yet said yes or no to that. They have endorsed the campaign, as have a number of other Aboriginal groups, the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg. There's the Blood Ties Four Direction Center in Whitehorse. There's a few others within the list of 190. So we have some measure of support there, but we'd like to get much more engagement, not just around the campaign committee, but really in the substance of the policy around the federal plan. We have a lot of work to do to understand what Aboriginal people have already been identifying as what they would like to see. Same for other groups that are more disproportionately at risk of poverty. We recently had a roundtable in Ottawa 2 weeks ago with the disability community, and the disability community has given a lot of thought as to what they are looking for from the federal government to improve the outcomes of those with disabilities. So it was an opportunity for other groups to kind of understand what the disability community has already identified. Okay. Yes?
Could you comment on the experiment that was done, I think it was about mid-70s, in Manitoba around giving a whole community a guaranteed annual income?
Yes. So the question is, can I comment on the experiment in the 1970s when 2 communities in Manitoba were given a guaranteed income over a period of several years. And Jim's actually a bit of an expert on that as well. No, I shouldn't say as well. He's got much more knowledge on it than I do. But what I do know, I guess because I have the microphone, I should try to address it. But what I do know is it was called the Manitoba MINCOM, for minimum income. And it was one of 5 experiments conducted in North America. 4 were in the US and 1 was in Canada. The US ones began in the 60s, I believe. Some of them, I believe, in the 60s, and the Canadian one began in the mid-1970s. And the Canadian experiment was meant to go for 5 years, and it ran a bit shorter than that. But the idea was to give a number of households a guaranteed income of a certain amount, and then to evaluate what effects that income would have on their participation in the labor market force. And the study was, the experiment was done in Manitoba. It was a joint federal and provincial program. I forget the exact number of households that were involved, but it was a number of households in Winnipeg, sort of scattered all over in a bit of a random sample, and then the entire community of Dauphin, Manitoba, which jumped up and down, I guess, when they won that lottery. But they got chosen to be the entire community was in receipt of the MINCOM, and the amounts ranged. There were several $1,000s. I think there were 3 tiers of guaranteed income, several thousand per household, and then researchers evaluated, well, what effect is this having on participation in the paid labor market? Because guaranteed income, which is a concept that's been around for many years, one of the big concerns is, well, if people have a guaranteed income, it's unconditional, there's no requirement for them to participate in this or that, is that going to cause many people to drop out of the paid labor market? The data that was assembled for the US experiments and the Manitoba experiment appears to show that there's no significant negative benefit or negative impact on labor market participation. And there's some other very interesting findings that were documented as well that researchers have been looking into, such as impacts upon households and sort of family cohesion. One of the findings that seems to be apparent, Jim and I learned about at a basic income conference that Jim organized in Ottawa a couple weeks ago, is Evelyn Forget, who's a researcher at the University of Manitoba, is going into thousands upon thousands of boxes of data from the Manitoba MINCOM and looking at what else emerged from that. One of the things she found is that high school participation and graduation rates went up significantly in those few years that families had that income. There's quite a marked result there. Still too early to say it was exactly because of the guaranteed income, but it seems awfully of great interest that one metric went way up. She is going to be publishing her findings on the MINCOM experiment quite soon, and others have done a little bit of publishing around that. Jim, I can give you the microphone if you want to comment any further.
That covers it.
That covers it? Okay. Yes.
Rob, I was interested when you just mentioned Manitoba. You said Dauphin won the lottery, jump up and down. The latest presentation on guaranteed income that I've seen endorsed in Canada was the Green Party in the last election. And I'm sure you're familiar with what they said at that subsistence level. Do you want to comment on that?
The Green Party of Canada, in their election platform, they had a commitment to at least reopen discussion across the country around guaranteed income. And they called it the guaranteed livable income, I believe was the phrase they used. There are different terms for this concept. There's basic income, there's citizens' income, there's guaranteed livable income. And I think their commitment was basically to reopen the conversation about this as a possibility for the country. If they use the phrase subsistence level of existence or subsistence income, I think that's a bit unfortunate because many of us who are involved in the basic income discussion and are proponents of basic income or guaranteed income as one way to help not only combat poverty but also combat inequality and promote freedom and a whole bunch of other good things in our society, believe that the level of income needs to be at least at the low income cutoff and hopefully at least a little bit above that. So people's basic needs are going to be assured. Senator Hugh Segal is very strong on this. He speaks very, very powerfully about how a basic income can make such a difference. And his vision is a low-income cutoff line plus $2,000 or $3,000. That would amount to roughly about $20,000 for a single person in Regina, roughly, give or take $1,000 or $2,000. Don't necessarily quote me on that, but it's in that ballpark. So I'm just thinking of one of the women I met yesterday, the single mom from Hungary, who's fallen through the cracks. She doesn't fit a whole bunch of areas where supports would possibly be for her. And she talked about how she volunteers for 2 or 3 organizations. She has a physical education degree which hasn't been recognized in Canada. She's not been able to work in that field. She loves working with children, but doesn't have the qualifications to even work in a child care facility. If she had a basic income, what that woman could do and what a difference it would make for her and her young boy and possibly other children that she's still responsible for would be enormous. And that reality could be repeated millions of times over in this country. And we can afford to bring in a basic income for Canada. Hugh Siegel has estimated it would cost about an extra 20 or 25 billion on top of what we're already spending in income supports. And that's well within what we can afford as a country that has a $1.5 trillion economy. Yes?
Just on that economic point, though, is there not evidence from other countries that if we did, as a country, make that investment in a guaranteed income or however we did it, that in fact the net government cost would be negligible or negative because we have offsetting reductions in things like crime rates, people going to jail, all the charity programs, et cetera, presumably those diminish as we had a more equitable system. Isn't there evidence from Europe about that, where you invest in social equality with a less government investment?
Yeah, so to summarize the question, which is basically to do with what happens when we invest more in Social Security? It may seem to be costing more, but there are reduced costs on the downstream end, if you will. And I think we do see that. There is data to show from Europe, from the OECD, that the countries that invest the most in social development and Social Security have the lowest rates of poverty and some very interesting other outcomes, such as highest reported rates of life satisfaction, higher voter participation rates, better health outcomes. There is data definitely to show that, and it's principally from the Nordic countries, but other countries too, like the Netherlands, have shown that correlation. So it's a conversation we need to have in Canada, that if we're prepared to invest more in our Social Security and social development, we are going to be better off as a society and better off as individuals. With regard to guaranteed income, because there's no program that I'm aware of that's sort of really widely spread within a given country, with the possible exception of Brazil, where there's a guaranteed income for families with young children, and there is a condition that the children have to be going to school, but Brazil is providing a guaranteed income for those families. Now that would be covering millions of people. Brazil's a population of, I don't know, it's very large. It's the 5th most populous country in the world, so it's way more people than Canada are actually receiving a guaranteed income. But it's still very early days. I think it's just intuitive, though, if people have security of income and are able to make better life choices for themselves that are more appropriate for who they are and what their skills and aptitudes are, people are going to make better choices and will likely have a healthier and happier existence. Yes?
On the child poverty question, sort of the government or the trend has been towards something like the National Child Benefit Program. That's sort of been kind of the response. Do you have any comments on that kind of structure and how that's impacted on poverty in general and the scope of it? Is that the kind of thing you support yours?
Okay. So the question is on the National Child Benefit, which is one of our main social support programs introduced in the 1990s, and whether or not to have any particular comment on that or endorse or support. To be honest with you, I actually have not looked into that particular program to the depth that I should. In a macro sense, because the child poverty rate has barely budged, or by at least one metric, like the Conference Board of Canada is using, has actually increased between the mid-1990s in the mid part of this decade. It would seem to me that, in fact, that measure has not brought the results that some people might think it has. Why is the child poverty rate so persistently high? Why has it been so difficult to knock it so low when there has been so much emphasis on child poverty and so much investment in a lot of areas? That's a big question which many of you probably can answer, but just with respect to the National Child Benefit, it doesn't appear to have brought the depth of results that perhaps were thought when it was introduced. But the concept of families, at least low-income families, being eligible for what amounts to a basic income, mind you, it is conditional on their other income, but that concept that this is sort of like basically a right that has to be provided to those young families with young children. I think the premise is a good one, and in fact, Jim has done a lot of thinking around what a comprehensive income security program for Canada could look like, starting with children and moving up to seniors, and then also encapsulating the working age adult population. And in the vision that Jim has roughed out, and I think it's a very interesting vision that we need to have a lot more discussion on, I think the National Child Benefit remains, if I'm correct, Jim, as part of the architecture.
Just to comment very quickly, we could spend another hour, but as Rob says, I think lots more thinking needs to be done on this. But I don't think there's anything in the offing, like in terms of a big bang, monolithic, one-size-fits-all guaranteed income program on the horizon. And in fact, we might want to worry about that in the sense that it may be worse than what we already have, inadequate as the current system may be. So I think people like Tony Martin are thinking about this, and maybe you, Siegel, too, that if we can think about taking the pieces we already have, you know, the National Child Benefit for kids, the Old Age Security Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors, I mean, even the GST rebate for low-income people, take all these different pieces but try to fit them together in a, you know, sort of a jigsaw puzzle that really covers people and really provides people with a floor. I mean, I think that's the short answer to the question now. You know, the devil's in the details, and how does that work, and how much does it cost, and will it really reach everybody? I mean, those are questions we still need to deal with, I think, but it's a good thought, Doug. Okay, Kirk.
I was just wondering, Rob, the campaign that you've described and packaged up really nicely today, you've mentioned that it's firmly rooted in the context of human rights, and this relates to the UN Covenant on Social and Human Rights. I'm just wondering what your experience has been in trying to engage the federal government in sort of looking at the commitment that they haven't been meeting. If you have thoughts about how to engage government around the human rights question.
Okay, so the question is around engaging the federal government in the human rights context around poverty. Is a good question. Bonnie and others have been at this for much longer time than I have, and have been, you know, kind of hammering away on the human rights theme for a long time. Have represented Canadian NGOs in front of the United Nations to comment on Canada's human rights performance, particularly with respect to economic and social rights. We are still in the very early days of the campaign, and are framing the campaign around Canada's human rights obligations. And I think it's fair to say most parliamentarians are really in the dark on this stuff. And in some ways it's intentional. When Canada reported to the UN Human Rights Council with respect to the many recommendations the Council made to Canada on human rights issues in February this year, Canada reported back in June and gave its response on all of that. It was done by, if I'm correct, it was done by the Deputy Minister of Justice. So it wasn't a cabinet minister, it wasn't any politician. It was done by the Deputy Minister of Justice, and with the support basically of from what we can tell, a fairly low-level group of bureaucrats supporting that process. There was some civil society consultation, but parliamentarians we've spoke to on this, many of them said they knew nothing about that process. They don't know what the UN Human Rights Council is. Oh, Canada reported? What are we reporting? Oh, that's interesting. And these are people who are pretty plugged into social justice concerns who knew nothing about this process. So we have a big hill to climb just to get the parliamentarians to understand the international framework by which Canada is going to be evaluated on a regular basis, not just with respect to one or two treaties, but in fact the whole basket of treaties and covenants that Canada has signed on to. They all have their reporting requirements now. And our big challenge for civil society is to help Canadians understand this human rights framework, get more civil society groups engaged in the process by which Canada is going to report on, and to try to influence how other countries are perceiving Canada. Because the Canadian government can report one thing that in fact is not utterly truthful of the on-the-ground situation. And so civil society has a big role to play there. We've got a big job to do just to educate our own parliamentarians about this stuff, some of whom won't accept that poverty, for example, is a human rights issue. They just won't, but many of them will. And we need to find the champions who do accept it as a human rights issue and will speak up in favor of what we're asking for from a strong human rights framework.
Okay, any last questions? I realize folks probably have to get on to whatever at 1 o'clock. Anything on the web that we need to respond to?
Yeah, someone just sent their big question.
Okay.
David Shantz, Regina, Dean,
Yeah. By the way, welcome to all the folks out in cyberspace. I think there's an even bigger group out in cyberspace. 19 people.
We noticed the cameras on the Regina streets. You know, this is starting to get a little spooky.
We're highly wired.
Okay, so it's a fairly big question, so I can't really screen it too quickly, so I'll just read it out. Thank you for speaking. You note that there may be significantly higher rates of high school completion seems to indicate the overall well-being of the community improves with guaranteed income. The conditions may lower the overall cost of society of this program, but also increase the overall domestic production at the same time. Is there any research-based estimate as to the rate that persons move beyond the need for guaranteed support once they receive it?
Okay, so that's a big question. I think to try to summarize, is there any evidence that a certain level of basic income or guaranteed income enables people to move off other forms of social supports? Is that the gist?
Is there any research-based estimate as to the rate that persons move beyond the need for guaranteed support once they receive it? So I guess once they start receiving that basic, do they move beyond that? That they no longer need the guaranteed income support?
Oh, okay. So if people receive a guaranteed income, and if they're on some forms of social supports, will the guaranteed income eventually allow them to move off the guaranteed income because they're earning enough through their participation in the paid labor market force? I don't think we have any.
I think the short answer is no.
Yeah. I don't think there's any evidence because there is no single large-scale program that we're aware of anywhere in the world where this is kind of being done. There are some interesting programs, though, like Alaska for over 30 years has had what's called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is revenue from the state's oil extractions. A portion of that revenue, a portion of that wealth is distributed to every person in the state, irrespective of their income and so forth. If you will, it's a true basic income because it's completely unconditional on how much income you already have. It's apparently the most popular program in Alaska, not surprisingly. It'd be interesting to know actually what sociological effects it actually has on people, particularly for those in the lower income or middle income spectrum. What difference does it make to them to have, it amounts to a couple of thousand per person per year. So a family of four could get, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 US a year. That's a pretty good investment in some real critical needs that family might not otherwise be able to make. There may be research around that, Jim. I don't know if you know of anything in particular, but
it depends partly on the model of guaranteed income. if it's not targeted to low-income people, I mean, even if you're wealthy, you get it. But if it's a negative income tax or targeted program, then you're withdrawn off the program as your income rises. So, but I mean, it's this might be the kind of question that gets addressed more as more work is done with the MINCOM data from Manitoba from, 25 or 30 years ago. So. Okay, I think it's 5 after 1, so we should probably wind up. Thanks very much for coming, and for the folks out on cyberspace too for your input. And I want to especially, of course, thank Rob for his thoughtful and thought-provoking comments, and wish him well with the Dignity for All campaign and on the rest of his Western Canadian tour as well. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate you coming. And for those who didn't get a card, let me give that to you. And if you would like my business card as well, I'm happy to pass those around.